Well, thank you, Sergio, very much for that generous introduction, and I'm really very grateful to you and the Fundação Cardoso for inviting me here to Sao Paulo for today's event. And I also hope it's the first of many return visits. I'm very intrigued by the work that you are doing here at the Foundation on international relations, but other subjects. So I hope that this is not, as the British would say, a one-off event, and we can have more such interactions. And I would like to thank also the China-Brazil Business Council, in particular, Ambassador Amaral, for your co-hosting me on this visit, not just today, but over the past few days. I'm most grateful to you and to Julia Diaz-Leite for inviting me to Brazil. And to see my old colleague, friend, and neighbor, Ambassador Huguenet. We lived down the street from each other in Beijing for 1 year. When you served as ambassador to Brazil, I was had a sabbatical from my university and was a visiting scholar at the Academy of Social Sciences, and we had opportunity to interact in Beijing. So it's very nice to see you again, sir. Welcome back. As the Chinese would say, welcome back to the motherland. So, really, thank you very much. This is a great honor and pleasure to be here and to address you this evening, not about my new book, although I'm happy to discuss the new book in the question and answer period if you like, and encourage you maybe all to go get a copy. But tonight I'm going to talk about domestic China. The book is called China Goes Global. It's more about what China is doing externally. In fact, it's entirely about what China is doing externally. This evening, though, I'd like to discuss internal events, and particularly in the wake of the recent Chinese leadership transition and the outcome of that transition, which is still rather recent, so it's difficult to make conclusions about such an event that is, it's just taken place over the last half a year, and to discuss the policy challenges that the new Chinese leadership faces. So that's the topic for this evening. So after, I'm going to divide my remarks generally into those two categories. First, I'll talk about the leadership transition, and then I'll talk about the policy challenges. And at the end, we'll actually have some observations about the state of the Chinese political system. So let's start with the leadership side of the equation, leadership transition. So leadership transitions in China are now regularized. They take place actually every 5 years at the Chinese Communist Party's Congress. This was the 18th Party Congress that they held last November. But the transitions are lengthy. It's not just, they don't just take place at the Congress. They take place sort of 2 years leading up to the Congress, and I would argue at least a year and a half, maybe 2 years after the Congress. So they're what Americans we would call rolling transitions. They're not simply, you don't be inaugurated into office on one day and begin work the next. So there's a lot of, the Chinese are now into what you might call the consolidation phase. These new leaders are into a really 18-month to 24-month period of trying to consolidate their new positions and their new power. And I guess one conclusion I would offer you this evening is that one should not expect too many new policy initiatives until they have consolidated their power. So that's going to be, as I say, 18 months from now, or maybe less, we'll see. But it took 2 years of preparations and secret maneuvering before the so-called fifth generation of leaders came to power. This is, the Chinese identify generations after 1949, so this is the fifth generation that has ruled China since '49. So we now know who they are, who will rule China for the next 5 years, if not in many cases 10 years. But the questions really are what characterizes the new elite How are they likely to rule? When might we see new policy initiatives? What will those policy initiatives look like? And how stable is the new party state, Chinese Communist Party state? So these are the questions I'm going to address for you this evening. So true to Chinese communist tradition, and we have to remember this is a communist system, right? I don't use that term lightly. There are only 4 left in the world: North Korea, Cuba, Laos, and China, ruled by communist parties. And communist parties, have certain characteristics, certain Leninist characteristics, certain organizational characteristics, certain ideological characteristics. So today, we sometimes sort of lose sight of the fact that China is still a communist party. You don't read that much in the media about that dimension of China. But those of us who study Chinese politics, that is very much an issue that we are aware of, and I think we should keep in mind. So one dimension of how Chinese communists, or all communists for that matter, when they have leadership transitions, it's done in secret, right? There's no transparency involved at all. It's orchestrated entirely behind closed doors with a lot of factional maneuvering and manipulation by retired party elders. That was the case this time as well. What was a little different this time is right in the middle of the run-up to the 18th Party Congress, a major scandal erupted, the so-called Bo Xilai affair, which I'm sure you're familiar with, so I don't hopefully have to tell you about it. Bo Xilai, for that matter, has still yet to be brought to trial or even accused of any crimes. He hasn't been seen in public since he disappeared in October 2012, I guess it would be, right? That's another feature of the Chinese system, right? People can just disappear. Major leaders just kind of disappear. Of course, his wife has not disappeared. She was sentenced to a long prison term for murdering a British national. So anyway, the Bo Xilai scandal erupted on the eve of the transition, and I'm sure it added certain more drama to the transition than otherwise would have been the case, but also added more uncertainty to it. So the Communist Party of China has now had its 10-year turnover of leaders, and the way it was done, I would say the opacity, lack of transparency of the selection and the appointment process, the intense bargaining for patron-client networks, we call it, behind-the-scenes intervention of party elders, especially former leader Jiang Zemin, who was quite interventionist and got his way. One outcome you would see of the new leadership is that a number of his protégés were put into power, and a number of the protégés of Hu Jintao, the outgoing leader, did not succeed to go into power. So Hu Jintao was not able to arrange his own succession. Jiang Zemin, in fact, had more effect on the new leadership than did Hu Jintao. So in this regard, I would say, just note that China's political system remains very immature and unaccountable. And that's on sort of the negative side of the ledger. On the positive side is at least they have regularized leadership transitions now. That's a big change from the past, from the Maoist era, and is in fact one of the lasting legacies of Deng Xiaoping himself. He's the one who instituted this process. But it's also a result, I would argue, of the lessons that the Chinese learned from the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Chinese have learned many things from the collapse of the Soviet Union. They continue to study the causes of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the East European Communist Party states to this day. I'll talk about that later. Xi Jinping, the new leader, has already given at least one internal speech about the lessons to be learned from the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was, 1991? Quite a while ago. But not for the Chinese communist leaders. It wasn't a long time ago. It was almost like yesterday. So this is still very present in their psychology, I think. And leadership transitions is one of the lessons they learned. Of course, the Soviet leaders never transitioned. They died in office or they were purged from office. It's the only way you left office in the Soviet Union, and that's the only way you left office in Maoist China. So one of Deng's reforms was, in fact, to regularize the transitions. So this transition was unveiled in three phases. First, at the 18th Party Congress in November of last year, which immediately was followed, and that appointed the senior party leaders. That was immediately followed by the appointment of the new Central Military Commission, military leaders. And that was followed in March of this year at the 12th National People's Congress with the new government appointments in the National People's Congress itself and in the State Council in particular. So these three, this transition took 6 months through these three different events, and it produced a sweeping turnover of personnel. Bear with me while I give you a few mind-numbing statistics. So the new Standing Committee of the Political Bureau, which is the highest body in China, was elected with 7 members. That shrunk, in fact, by 2. It used to be 9, now down to 7. A full Politburo of 25 members was elected. A new Central Committee of 205 members was elected. And a secretariat, they call it, of the Politburo, 7 members, was selected. In fact, I use the word elected in quotation marks in all of these cases. This is not a democratic system, right? There are no real elections. This is selection, what political scientists call the selectorate, not the electorate. We have to remember that. But nonetheless, the turnover was substantial. 70% of the Central Committee of the Politburo were replaced because they had reached the age threshold for retirement. That's another lesson learned from the Soviet Union, that you've got to get people out of office at a certain age. Just because they're out of office, though, doesn't mean that they lose their influence, as we learned with Jiang Zemin. Okay, so the new standing committee of the Political Bureau, to me, appears to be filled with staunchly strong conservative individuals, not dissimilar from the last standing committee. But the Politburo itself, the 25-member Politburo, is more reformist, if you look at the composition of that body. So to me, this would suggest that for the next 5 years, until the next party Congress, the 19th Party Congress in 2017, is going to see a continuation of the last 5 years, which have been deeply conservative, I would say. Retrogressive, actually, in several policy spheres, and not reformist. Hu Jintao's second term was not at all progressive or reformist. I'll talk about that in a minute. So I would expect more conservatism, more risk aversion, not too much reform for the next 5 years. But after the next party Congress, when the those members who are 62 years old and above have to retire, then the more reformist elements of the Politburo will have their chance. So 5 years from now, we may actually, you can invite me back if you like, Sergio. I'll come back and talk about. I'll come back and talk about the next Politburo. They may be more what we consider to be progressive and reformist. There are some interesting other characteristics to note of this new leadership. Their average age, 61 on average. And they're all in their early 60s for the most part, a few in their late 50s. This new leadership continues a trend that has been apparent now for at least 10 years of better educated leaders. 19 of the Politburo's 25 members now have university degrees. 1 has a degree from a military academy, and the remaining 5 have degrees from the Central Party School. So they all have some kind of university equivalent degree. By contrast, 30 years ago, the 1982 Politburo, none, not a single individual had a university degree. So this is a better educated group of Chinese leaders. And it's interesting, a change, in fact, of this new fifth generation from the third and the fourth generation is that they're educated in different fields. The third and the fourth generation were predominantly educated in engineering, almost exclusively in engineering, and some in the natural sciences. Now we have those with some background in economics, social sciences, law, journalism, and even humanities. The new 6 members of the new Politburo hold degrees in economics, 2 in international relations, 2 in literature, 1 in history, and 1, goodness, God forbid, in political science. And 13 of them have postgraduate degrees. There's also a better balance between those that come from coastal backgrounds and interior backgrounds. 14 members of the new 25-member Politburo have worked in the coastal provinces, 11 from central provinces, and none from the western part of the country, Qinghai, Gansu, Xinjiang, and Tibet. And the new Politburo is strongly civilian. Only 2 ex officio military members. So those are just some kind of statistical characteristics of the new leadership. More interesting to you, perhaps, is where are they going to go? What new initiatives have they already indicated? Are there any early indicators, and what's the direction in which they may move? So they have. Well, let me start with the outgoing leadership, the Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao leadership, which is now widely viewed in China as having been quite ineffective. Many Chinese derisively refer to 10 lost years, the last 10 years as having been the 10 lost years. Certainly the last 4 or 5 years, I think that is true. The government and the party just seem to freeze up since 2009. I don't know if you noticed this when you were serving there, sir, but we haven't seen much in the way of reform in any sector since about 2009. And the party has become, what I would argue, the government too, rather sclerotic, like old people who get sclerosis. So why? One reason is I think the leadership transition was looming, and that sends the system into a kind of frozen state while they're trying to do all this maneuvering, figure out who's going to be promoted and who's not. So they're not able to kind of carry out new initiatives and normal government functioning when they're all maneuvering. So that's one factor that froze up the system. Secondly, they really feared that any real reforms that they initiated, particularly in the political area or media area, would quickly cascade out of control and could wind up undermining the party's overall grip on power. As I say, the Chinese communists live in dreadful fear of the Soviet example. They really do. I wrote my last book on that subject, and it's not just me. I mean, you interview them, you read their media, you read their speeches, and it's very clear that the events of 1989 to 91 are very present in their thinking. And if that's not enough, then the events of the color revolutions across Eurasia added to their, you might call it paranoia even. And if that wasn't enough, then the events of the Arab Spring have further compounded that. So they have watched these events over the last 20 years, and it's only kind of frozen their reforms. They know in many ways, if you talk to Chinese party members or government officials or intellectuals, they're very aware of what problems the country faces and what's really needed. But they disagree over how to respond, and they are fearful that any response will lead to an unpredictable end. In Chinese, really, if they can't predict something, they're very reticent to move down that path. The Chinese are they like to control. They have a real obsession, I would argue, with controlling everything, controlling meetings with foreigners, right? You've experienced that. Controlling everything. They're obsessed with control. So if they can't control the outcome of a reform, their tendency is not even to embark on the reform in the first place. So that's the reason why the last 4 or 5 years have been sort of frozen. And the new leadership inherits that. Now, that's not to say there's not going to be any new policy initiatives. Xi Jinping has already, I think, seemed a bit bolder than Hu Jintao. He certainly displays a more relaxed and friendly demeanor than did Hu Jintao. That was hard to get worse than. Hu was a very he was a very frozen figure. You know, his personality fit the kind of policies, or his policies fit his personality in many ways. But Xi Jinping is a more outgoing, relaxed individual. He also has an attractive younger wife who's a very popular singer, and that helps. And it's the first time we've ever had a Chinese leader whose wife travels with him abroad regularly, and dresses in very fashionably and is an object of media attention. This is new. It's good. It's good. His background is also different from Hu Jintao. Hu Jintao was a classic apparatchik technocrat, party engineer, somebody trained in engineering whose entire career worked his way up through the party apparatus. That's why we call them apparatchiks. It's a Soviet term. Xi Jinping, though, slightly different. He's what I would call a managerial princeling. He's a princeling because he's the son of Bo, who was one of the first generation senior leaders. And he's the managerial part is because he's not just been in administrative positions, he's actually worked in provinces and positions during the Cultural Revolution, where he learned a lot more about the common people and how to manage, large enterprises. He's also had previous exposure to the military, unlike Hu Jintao. He served as the secretary to the former Minister of Defense, Geng Biao, and he has worked very hard on building up his ties with the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, since he's come into office. And in the 5 short months since he has come into office, he's already struck several new themes. First theme, a tougher attitude towards tackling corruption, which is a cancer riddling the entire society and the entire party state in China. And they've appointed Wang Qishan, who as the director of the Central Discipline Inspection Commission, to head the new attack on corruption. So we'll see if Wang Qishan and this new initiative have any effect. I remember when Jiang Zemin launched a big attack on corruption. Then Hu Jintao launched a big attack on corruption, neither of which came to any fruition, and corruption just continued to fester and spread and deepen. And it's deepened now to extremely extensive point, not just in the government and the party, but throughout the society and the military in China. I frankly don't think they can get on top of the problem, even if they're serious about it. It's pervasive. And without any real institutional checks and balances, without an open media, without a real rule of law, without transparency, without asset declaration regulations and other things, they're not going to get on top of it. Xi Jinping has also signaled that he wants to crack down on extravagance, official extravagance. So he's issued an 8-point directive, about banquets. We only can have 4 dishes and a soup. No more baijiu, they call it the liquor, the Chinese liquor. No more motorcades for officials, and so on. So trying to ban extravagances. So that's another initiative. But the centerpiece of Xi Jinping's time so far has been this concept that he has put forward of the China Dream, the Zhongguo Meng, which is interesting. It's yet to be fully elaborated. It's kind of work in progress, actually. But it seems, at least from his speeches, that it has at least 2 core elements. The first is a more equitable and communitarian society, because China is anything but an equitable and communitarian society. China, I believe, has now overtaken Brazil as having the world's highest Gini coefficient, a measure of social inequality, or it's least close to Brazil. And if anybody who's lived in China knows that this is a society of great inequity between wealthy and those who are not. And it's a society that is very divided between coast and inland. It's a society in which there's no rule of law, as I say. Everybody's living in a kind of Hobbesian, what I call Hobbesian hedonism, trying to get what they can get as quickly as they can get it. And so that's produced a very unstable, inequitable society. And Xi Jinping's China Dream, just like Hu Jintao's harmonious society concept, it doesn't seem very different, frankly, from Hu Jintao's harmonious society concept. It's just repackaged and renamed. That seems to be one element of his dream. Second element of the dream is the so-called renaissance or revival, the Da Fu Xing, they call it in Chinese, the Da Fu Xing of the Chinese nation. That is a notion to restore China to its central place in the global order and for all Chinese to have dignity and in the world. But it also seems that Xi Jinping's notion of the China Dream has a more nationalistic edge to it, a harder edge to it. Within 1 week of becoming the leader of the party last November, he led the Politburo Standing Committee, top 7 members of the country, to the National Museum on Tiananmen Square, which is now reopened, to view the exhibition, permanent exhibition in the museum called the China's Road to Rejuvenation, the Fuxing Zhilu Zhanlan Hui, which I don't know if anybody in here been to see this very inspiring exhibition? No. Well, it's you can go, as I say, it's a permanent display. Next time you go to Beijing, I encourage you to go look at it. It's really, it's all about the so-called 100 years of shame and humiliation that China had suffered at the hands of the West and Japan. It's all about imperialist exploitation and all the nasty, terrible things that foreigners have done to China for a very long time. And then the second part of the exhibition is how the Chinese Communist Party has delivered the nation since 1949, to a better place, to a renewal. And this is the second part of Xi Jinping's China Dream. But if you read the speeches he's been giving, as I say, there's a more negative nationalistic narrative to them. But by visiting that exhibition, the point is he was identifying himself with this aggrieved narrative, this historical, this very negative kind of narrative about China's past, and saying, we are going to stand up, we're going to be strong. And he's been giving these speeches about becoming strong. Fu Guo Changbing is the phrase he keeps using, which means wealthy country, strong military, actually. This is a new term that he's been using, but it goes back, it has antecedents all the way back to the 1870s and the self-strengthening movement. And he's been giving speeches to the People's Liberation Army. He's visited a lot of military units in the first 6 months, in which he calls on them to, quote, prepare to fight and win wars, unquote. He's said this several times now. And he personally directs the party's maritime leading small group, which is in charge of China's position on the East China Sea and South China Sea maritime disputes, both of which you probably know the Chinese have become increasingly assertive and muscular about in their patrols, naval patrols, but also their claims. So Xi Jinping's fingerprints are all over this new maritime assertiveness. So there's definitely a more militaristic, I would argue, dimension to Xi's China Dream. But finally, Xi shows no signs, so far, of wanting to launch political reforms at all. To the contrary, in his tour of Guangdong province in December, he went out of his way to deliver a blistering critique of Gorbachev's reforms. When I tell you that the Soviet experience is in the front part of the Chinese leaders' minds, I'm not kidding. So here we are, 22 years after the Soviet Union collapsed, and the leader of the Chinese Communist Party gives a speech in which he says that the party must maintain strict party control over the military. We must stand firm on the party's leadership over the military. Why? Because that is the lesson from the collapse of the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, where the military was depoliticized, separated from the party, and nationalized, the party was disarmed, unquote. So, that's not exactly a signal about political reform, and it is very much a signal about the party's control over the military, the gun. All of which tells me that the party knows that it has problems, and that at the end of the day, it may need to be saved again by the army. It's not the first time. Remember 1989? Remember other periods, 1967? The Chinese military has saved the Chinese Communist Party in the past, and Xi Jinping is very aware that they may need to do so again. But my point is that without political reforms, there can be no real economic reform in China, particularly no economic reform of the state sector, and no real addressing of the corruption problem. So, without political reform, can the educational system be reformed. And unless the educational system is reformed, China's not going to become an innovative society. And if China doesn't become an innovative society, it's not going to escape the middle income trap that they are now in, so-called middle income trap of low-end manufacturing exports. They won't be able to move up the value chain and begin to build a knowledge-intensive economy and export knowledge-intensive goods without innovation. But innovation is linked to education, and education is linked to politics and culture. And I would argue that there are a lot of elements of traditional Chinese culture that are not very innovative. They're very conservative. Risk-taking is not rewarded in Chinese culture. Very conservative. No critical thinking. Chinese exams are still, it's all about rote memorization. When you take an exam in China at the university level, you know what the questions are before you take the exam. You can buy the books. The teachers won't give it. You go to the bookstore, you buy them, and you memorize the answers. And then you sit the exam, you provide verbatim answers. And the better your memory is to remember the verbatim answer, the higher your score is. And then you get rewarded with jobs. That's not the basis. There's no critical analysis, critical thinking, no autonomy of the intelligentsia, no autonomy of the media. So until you have those things, to my mind, you're never going to build an innovation economy. You can't build an innovation economy in an autocratic system. So those are some early signs from Xi Jinping. Li Keqiang, for his part, the new premier, he hasn't been in office very long, and he hasn't really said too much yet, except that he signaled that he wants to reduce bureaucratic red tape. And he argues that the central government is overly involved in administering too many elements of society and the economy, and he has outlined plans to reduce the government approval process by 1/3. But a lot of observers, myself included, are very skeptical of Li Keqiang's ability to be premier of that country. We'll have to see if he's really up to the job. A lot of Chinese don't think he's up to the job. Many Chinese wanted Wang Qishan to become the new premier. But that is the one thing that Hu Jintao got in the new leadership. Li Keqiang is Hu Jintao's man. Li Keqiang has been Hu Jintao's protege for over 25 years. So that was the one reward Hu Jintao got. So what are the main policy challenges that they're facing? There's a pretty strong consensus, I would argue, inside of China and outside of China on what these challenges are. First and most important is to reorient the economic growth model away from the growth model for the last 30 years. It's been very successful, right? Extremely successful. And it's been premised on two elements: domestic investment and domestic investment, first of all, but mainly in infrastructure. And secondly, exports, subsidized exports. That needs to be replaced by increased domestic consumption, spending on domestic consumption, and innovation, building a knowledge economy with service industries. So that's the big macro challenge. Secondly, downsizing the state sector of the economy, breaking the monopoly of the 145,000 state-owned enterprises, decentralizing economic decision-making. It's much too heavily concentrated and centralized today at the top, and deregulating the financial sector. Third, to adequately resource so-called public goods for the population: health care, environmental protection, improved quality of education, pensions, old age care, and so on. Fourth big challenge that most observers, or at least this one, but many people see, is the need to empower civil society and loosen controls over the media so as to facilitate the free flow of information that is really needed for a market economy to function and for an innovation society to be created. You can't have an innovation society, or at least, and a market economy is highly distorted unless you have full transparency and flow of information. Fifth, instituting a real rule of law so as to do a lot of things, including countering rampant corruption, rising crime, systemic abuse of power and privilege, and facilitating the proper functioning of a market economy. Sixth, deepening price reform and financial sector reform so as to remove distortions in the economy, which are still many. Seventh, to address the seething discontent in China's ethnic regions, in Xinjiang and Tibet, amongst the Uyghurs and the Tibetans in particular, and to address that discontent in more positive ways rather than just through intimidation and repression, which is what they have been doing for the last 20 years. I mean, it's no accident that Tibetans are self-immolating themselves on an almost weekly basis, and there have been major uprisings in Xinjiang as well in recent years. A few other elements that are needed: permit some political competition, even within a one-party dominant system. And up until 2009, they were actually flirting with this, what they call multi-party cooperation and competition, 多党合作. They have 8 other parties in China, believe it or not. You may not know that. In addition to the Chinese Communist Party, there are 8 others, which are all tools of the Communist Party, what they call United Front instruments. But they could begin to enfranchise those parties and empower them to some extent so they could compete on a local level, for example, for political office. And a few other elements that, for the sake of time, I won't mention. So these are the challenges everybody sees. And if you talk, as I say, to Chinese officials, Chinese intellectuals, Chinese journalists, these are all an open secret. Everybody knows this. And they know what they need to do, but as I say, they're kind of frozen because they're afraid of taking initiatives because it'll undermine party power. At the end of the day, it's all about party power. So the society and the party are now at a position where they're really operating at counterproductive, or not in tandem with each other, right? The society wants to go here, and the party wants to keep in power, so it's sort of holding these reforms back. This is different than 10 years ago, when the party was in fact leading the reforms in the economic sector and social sector and in political reform up until 2008 or 9. And finally, the other set of challenges that China faces is in the foreign policy front, which I have to just briefly mention. We can talk about more if you're interested, including about China's relations with Latin America. So on the foreign policy front, major challenges are to manage rising strategic competition with the United States. The U.S.-China relationship is a mixture of cooperation and competition. That's always been the case. But what's new is that the balance has shifted. Competition is now predominant, I should say. Cooperation is now secondary. And this is new. This is the new normal, we call it in the United States, the new normal. We have to get used to it. It's not going to go back to the old, naive hope for cooperation. The U.S. and China are in a competitive relationship. There's no doubt about it. It's just a fact of life. Academics, say they can predict that very easily through what they call power transition theory, or for that matter, realist international relations theory. So it's to be expected. The question is how to manage it. And neither country has any experience with managing a strategically competitive relationship with another major power with which they are at the same time interdependent. All right? The U.S. and Soviet Union were not interdependent. So it was easier, in a way, to manage the Cold War. The U.S. and China are not in a Cold War. I'm not saying they're in a Cold War. But we are having increasing strategic competition, and I would argue that that strategic competition extends to this hemisphere, to South America, where China's presence is growing dramatically, and as you know, America's presence has been declining now for several years. But the United States is watching very carefully what China is doing here, not just in Brazil, but more broadly around the continent. And so far, the U.S. has not come to the conclusion that this is a threat to the United States' interests in the hemisphere. I repeat, the United States has not come to that conclusion yet, from what I understand. I'm not a government official. But China's footprint not only in Brazil, but across the South American continent and in Central America and the Caribbean and Mexico, or no, not Mexico so much as, is rapidly growing. And so that is an indication of the increasing global competition between the U.S. and China. Closer to China, so that's one foreign policy challenge. Second foreign policy challenge, managing strained relations with the EU. China-European relations are also not in very good condition. They're rather tenuous. They've gotten a little bit more stable since 2011, but they had been in a 5-year free fall prior to that. So the Chinese and the Europeans are not terribly close. China and Asia. China's relations with its neighbors in Asia, not very positive at all. China's Asian neighbors are rattled by their territorial claims, increasingly assertive, by their military modernization, and by their assertive diplomacy in multilateral organizations and bilaterally. And then finally, across what is sometimes referred to as the developing world, China is experiencing a deteriorating image in the last 18 to 24 months, including here in Latin America, including here in Brazil. I don't know if you've read any of the recent polls, but the Pew Global Attitude Survey, the BBC did a poll in 2012, and found that only 55% of Brazilians, 55%, have a positive image of China. That means 45% do not. It's mixed, more or less 50-50. But that's a change from 10 years ago, where I think probably in your society you had a much more positive, 80% maybe. So it's come down, but Brazil's not alone. This is happening across the continent, and it's happening across Africa as well. So Xi Jinping and his new foreign policy team, in my view, face real challenges on the international diplomatic front, with the Americans, with the Europeans, with their neighbors in Asia, and across the world south of the equator. Okay, let me just see if I can wrap up. So what if they do undertake reforms? Let's give them the benefit of the doubt. What if they do return to a reformist path? What will happen? My guess is that they will be blocked by various vested interest groups, of which there are essentially 4, what I call the iron quadrangle. First, so if you think of a quadrangle with four corners, China may not be a democracy, but it certainly has strong vested interest groups and bureaucratic politics. And though it's not unnatural that in any system, those who possess wealth, privilege, resources, power are not going to voluntarily give them up. Well, China has become, as I say, a stratified society in which some people possess a lot of wealth, privilege, power, and resources. And they're tied to the state sector. So one reason they're not going to dismantle the state sector of the economy is that would be dismantling people's personal gains. And there's a lot of corruption in this, too. And unless they dismantle the state sector of the economy, which is 30% of the overall GDP, that includes the banking sector, the energy sector, the telecom sector, the finance sector, much of the transportation sector, the defense sector, and other elements are all owned by the state and the party. They're not going to introduce the market mechanisms that are needed into the economy. So way back in 1917, Lenin wrote a very famous treatise about state monopoly capitalism. Well, China today is filled with state monopoly capitalism, or state monopoly socialism, you might call it. So these SOEs are one element of the quadrangle that are going to block reforms. The second element, the internal security apparatus. The People's Armed Police, the Ministry of State Security, the Ministry of Public Security, and a whole variety of provincial level security organs. This is one of the most heavily, policed states in the world. Why? Because China is a very unstable society. There are now nearly 100,000 incidences of unrest involving more than 300 people per year in China. It's a very unstable place. So the state has invested heavily. In fact, they invest more heavily. This is one of the most interesting statistics about China. Last year, the internal security budget was revealed by the government. I was shocked. Everybody was sort of shocked they revealed it. Turns out it's actually the Ministry of Public Security budget was $118 billion. And the military's budget was less than that, $112 billion. So they spend more money on internal security than they do on external security. And as I say, that only was the Ministry of Public Security. They didn't say what the Ministry of State Security is or what the People's Armed Police, which have about 1 million personnel. So, the internal security budget could easily be $200 billion, frankly. So this is all an indication to me of the instability of the society. Third element of this iron quadrangle, the military itself, okay, which has been benefiting from lots of money for a long time. And fourthly is the conservative arm of the party. The party, in my view, is actually split quite clearly. And if you interview or talk to people in the party, it's pretty evident that there are the predominant faction of very conservative leaders, mainly, who are afraid of undertaking reforms for the reasons I've been saying. And then younger party members who are in favor of reforms and are much more progressive, but they don't have any resources and they're not in position of power to do anything about it. So the conservatives, the military, the internal security apparatus, and the state-owned enterprises are all what I call the iron quadrangle together. Their interests are reinforced. So a reform breaks their professional and their personal interests. Therefore, I'm not very optimistic myself that we're going to see much of any reform out of the new government, and even if they do, they're going to be blocked. So where does this leave us in conclusion? I think we need to look beyond the kind of immediate present and these new leaders and ask a little bit about the stability of this system. The Chinese communists have been in power for 60 years now. 63 years. It's the second longest ruling party in the world today, after North Korea, right, which came into power in 1945, I think. They have a lot of instruments of strength. They have the military, they have the internal security apparatus, they have the nomenclatura system for appointing officials. They have an economy, and they have a remarkable record of development that has benefited the country. So they have many things going for them. But I think if you look, or at least China watchers are cognizant of China's past dynasties, and there are a number of features that are present or were present in previous dynasties that I think one sees in today's China. These include, first of all, a hollow state ideology that the society does not believe in, if the state has an ideology at all. So Chinese government today doesn't really have an ideology, not a coherent one, and there's no evidence that the society believes in it. Second element that's very present at the end of Chinese dynasties is, if not throughout Chinese history, is elite factionalism and scheming. Well, we've seen a lot of that in the run-up to the last Congress. Third, intensified corruption and self-serving officials. Fourth, pronounced inequality between haves and have-nots. Fifth, a pervasive sense of uncertainty and frustration amongst the population. And this is a highly frustrated society. I think you probably experienced, Ambassador, when you live there. Everybody's frustrated for different reasons, but everybody's frustrated. A failure to provide adequate social welfare to society, rising social and ethnic unrest, declining respect for central authority and increased localism, no real rule of law, and the capriciousness of the state. And finally, overtaxation, in which taxes are being siphoned off into officials' pockets. All of these elements were present at the end of the Qing dynasty, present at the end of the Republican era, and they are present today in the People's Republic of China. So, and if that's not enough, I think you have to note that the wealthy Chinese elites, the people who have benefited the most from reforms and the economic development of China over the last 30 years, what are they doing? Well, they have one foot out the door. They've got foreign bank accounts, foreign property, foreign assets, foreign residency status. They would have a foreign passport if the Chinese government would allow dual nationality, but the Chinese government doesn't allow dual nationality. Their kids are all in foreign universities, and they have lots of relatives abroad. And they are ready to bolt at a moment's notice, I would argue, as soon as the system begins to crack and fall. They know better than anybody that the system is unstable and cracking already, present tense. And so they're ready to leave the country tomorrow if necessary, but they will stay as long as they can to extract every last renminbi that they can. They want to make money while they can, but they'll put, where do they put their money? Not into Chinese banks, no, they put them into foreign banks in the Grand Cayman Islands and Barbados and the Channel Islands and Hong Kong and elsewhere. So that tells me a lot. That speaks volumes to me about the instability and fragility of the Chinese Communist Party state. Now, I don't see this as a very stable system, frankly. Doesn't mean it's going to collapse tomorrow or implode like the Soviet Union did. As they say, they have a lot of strengths, and they have, above all, been studying the Soviet example for a long time, and they're not going to let that happen. And as Xi Jinping told us in his speech, the party must control the gun, and they will use the gun to stay in power, as they have done before. What that will produce is anybody's guess, but I'm sorry, I've gone on longer than I expected. I hadn't given this talk before, so I wasn't quite sure how long it was going to last, but be happy to listen to comments and take questions.
Thank you so much, David.